Hello, boys and girls. You say hello to Miss Murray. Hello, Miss Murray. Boys and girls, today our story is called Dancing Hands. And the subtitle says How Teresa Carreno Played the Piano for President Abraham Lincoln. This story was written by Margarita Engel and it was illustrated by Rafael Lopez. So our story starts a long time ago, back when President Abraham Lincoln was president. So that was back about 150 years ago from now. So Dancing Hands starts when Teresa was a little girl in Venezuela. Well, let's take a look at our big map here and find out. Oh, here we are in North America in Fresno, California. And here is the country of Venezuela. So that's very far away. So Teresa was a little girl in Venezuela, and Mama sang lullabies while Papa showed Teresita how to let her happy hands dance all across the beautiful dark and light keys of the piano. At first, making music seemed magical, but soon Teresa learned that playing a piano can be hard work. Sometimes she had to struggle to make the stubborn music behave, so she practiced gentle songs that sounded like colorful birds singing in the dark branches, and the powerful songs that roared like prowling jaguars beside towering waterfalls in a mysterious green jungle. If Teresa felt sad, music cheered her up. And when she was happy, the piano helped her share bursts of joy. By the time she was 6 years old, she could write her own songs, and at 7, she performed in the peaceful chapel at the magnificent cathedral, playing hymns that shimmered just like hummingbirds. Music was Teresita's delight, but suddenly, when she was 8 years old, a war changed everything. Guns blazed, swords flashed, and poor Papa had to rush the whole family down to the seashore and onto a ship. And a storm where the wind howled, the waves rolled, barrels tumbled, ropes snapped, and clouds bucked and kicked across the wild sky like angry mules. By the time the ship arrived in New York City in America, Teresa felt lost. She was homesick. How could she ever play the happy songs again in this unfamiliar country where she did not know one single friend? Few people in America spoke Spanish, and all around her, curious strangers stared and whispered, as if her whole family belonged in a museum of oddities. Worst of all, there was fighting in America too, because the horrible Civil War, the North battling the South, soldiers marched, and newspaper boys hollered about victories, defeats, funerals, and fear. Without a new piano, Teresa would have felt even more lonely. But soon she discovered that wherever there was a piano, some people were friendly, and they were drawn together by the songs. Musicians came to her home, and they played along while they listened to the dazzling notes of her dancing hands. Determined to improve, Teresa practiced graceful waltzes and sonatas, booming symphonies, and lively folk songs, her strong hands accepting the challenge of life's many dark and light moods. People began to call her the piano girl. Her picture was in the newspaper and on posters advertising concerts where she performed with great orchestras, and they invited her to come and play solos. Teresa triumphed in enormous theaters where children clapped and cheered while their parents stood up and they tossed roses toward her. With Papa at her side, she traveled to elegant cities, and by the time she was 10 years old, the piano girl grew so famous that she received amazing invitations, including one so special she could hardly believe her eyes. President Abraham Lincoln wanted her to play for his whole family at the White House. But the country was still at war. So Teresa arrived in Washington, D.C. at a time When freed slaves were signing up to be soldiers, the injured moaned and nurses groaned from the sheer weariness of caring for so many fevers and so many wounds. Not long ago, the president's young son had fallen sick, and he had died. Men argued about battles lost and battles won, and speeches made and victory delayed. Teresa began to worry. How could music soothe so much trouble? Poor Abraham Lincoln. Teresa hoped that she could entertain the president and his grieving wife and their two surviving sons. Her fingers might stumble. The rhythms emerging, they would be too slow or maybe too fast. But Teresa was brave, and she believed in trying her very best, so she entered the White House silently, clutching Papa's hand fiercely as they stepped into a room so red it looked like a storm or a sunrise. Teresa remembered how it felt to be a homeless refugee and how lonely she had been, surrounded by strangers, some of them rude, some of them kind. The memory of meeting past challenges now helped her fingers dance, celebrating the way life had turned out to be a mixture of all sorts of feelings, happy and sad. Oh, but sadly, the piano was a poor instrument, poorly tuned, making her music sound ugly. What should she do? Refuse to play? She stopped, she felt discouraged, until Mr. Abraham Lincoln smiled kindly and asked her for his favorite song, Listen to the Mockingbird. Teresa knew she could play this lively piece even on an imperfect piano. So her fingers leapt across the glorious dark and light keys, improvising the way mockingbirds do, the melody changing as she went along. Music swirled and twirled and soared on the wings of song. I'm going to play that song for you right now. Listen to the Mockingbird was a song that was popular during the Civil War. Listen to the Mockingbird. The president listened quietly to the notes that rose and swayed and rippled and dipped like a bird in the blue sky above a green forest. He closed his eyes, he nodded his head, he stretched his long fingers, and he tapped the tips of his shiny shoes. When the joyful song ended, Abraham Lincoln stood up and clapped, smiling at the piano girl, who smiled too, because she knew that her music had brought comfort to a grieving family, at least for one brief, wonderful evening of dancing hands. From then on, Teresa felt certain she would always be bold enough to share her musical courage anywhere in the world, simply by letting her fingers travel across all the beautiful dark and light moments of hope. Friends, is this a true story? Yes, it is. Teresa Carreno, her actual long name was Maria Teresa Carreno Garcia de Sena. She was born in 1853, before the Civil War started. She was born into a very musical family in Venezuela, and really, by the time she was 8, she was composing her very own music. She grew up to be a very, very famous piano player and traveled all across the world as a young lady and an adult playing the piano. And she was also a composer, and she was also an opera singer. She traveled all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. She returned to Venezuela only once because her countrymen disapproved of her, because she had been divorced 3 times. But she became known as a composer, one of the best piano players of her era, playing with such an intense spirit that audience members claimed they could hear the power of the tropical nature in her music. And finally, after she returned to New York during World War I and she died, finally her remains were returned to her home country of Venezuela, where she is remembered today as La Leona, the lioness of the piano. But she started out as a young girl, just like boys and girls today started out playing the piano as a young person and practiced and practiced and practiced until she became a person who had dancing hands on the piano. Friends, I will see you next time. Goodbye, boys and girls. See you next week. Goodbye, Ms. Murray.